We're happy to see you all today for this new session of the webinar. We are going to start in a minute. So the session will be recorded, and we will, if the recording works, try to put the video on our website in the next few days. So if you know some people that wanted to attend and couldn't, you can let them know that it should be available, as well as the other videos from the previous talks. So far, I think we've got them on the website as well. So welcome, everyone. We're going to start today. We are very honored to receive Rachel Cooper. She is a professor in the Department of Politics, Philosophy, and Religion at Lancaster University. Her research interests lie within the philosophy of science and medicine, especially philosophy of psychiatry. Her research focuses on conceptual problems around psychiatric classification and on understanding concepts of disorder and health. In Diagnosing the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published in 2014, she examines issues with the DSM-5. Her famous monograph, Classifying Madness, published in 2005, also concerns philosophical problems with psychiatric classification. And in Psychiatry and the Philosophy of Science, published in 2007, she examines the way in which psychiatric science is like and unlike more established sciences. She is interested in problems having to do with the concept of disorder and on what makes a condition count as a disorder, as opposed to a moral failing or a normal variation. And she has written widely on this problem. Today, she will give a talk on the concept of disorder revisited, robustly value-laden despite change, that got published in 2020 in the Aristotelian Society by Oxford University Press. Rachel Cooper, if you want to share your screen, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully this will work. Oh, there we are. Great.
Yes.
Well, thank you all very much. So thanks very much for coming. And thanks very much to the organisers for organising this. So I think one of the few good things to come out of the pandemic are these online philosophy talks. So it's really lovely to be able to, listen to other people's talks and for me to talk to you, kind of all around the world. That's really great. So the paper I've got for you today has already been published. Now, normally I'd give a new paper, but I'm giving this paper because I'm expanding this work into a book. So I'm really keen to have your feedback and have you tell me where I'm going horribly wrong and so on, because it's something I'm still working on developing. So many of you will know that there's been a long-term project in the philosophy of medicine and the philosophy of psychiatry where people have been trying to develop an account of disorder. And the way this debate has worked is that different authors some of them have focused on mental disorder, some have focused on disorder in general. The debate isn't really over what distinguishes mental and physical disorder, although there are interesting questions there. The question really is what distinguishes disorders from other kinds of states, so moral failings, normal differences, social problems, and so on. And in the debate, the term disorder or disease gets used as a kind of umbrella term. So in ordinary English, we might distinguish between diseases, injuries, wounds, disabilities. In this debate, they all get lumped together. So the question really is, what makes something any kind of pathological condition as opposed to an educational problem, or a normal difference, or a moral failing, something else. So I'm going to be talking about that debate today. I know this is a philosophy of psychiatry series, so most of the examples I'm concerned with have got to do with mental disorder, but I guess I see the debate over the concept of mental disorder as fitting in with this debate over the concept of disorder in general. So this is a project which has been going on since at least the 1970s. And the method that people have employed has been conceptual analysis. So some of you will be philosophers and be familiar with this, some might not be quite so familiar. So the idea of conceptual analysis is that it's supposed to be a way of unpicking how our concepts work. So what happens is a philosopher comes up with a first hypothesis, a first guess as to some necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of a concept. So we might, as a first guess, say that maybe disorders are harmful states, for example. And then as the debate goes on, that hypothesis gets tested by considering what we'd say about various actual and hypothetical cases. So suppose somebody says, oh, maybe for something to be a disorder, it just has to be harmful. Straight away, you can see that's inadequate, because you can say, well, what about poverty? Like poverty's harmful, but it's not a disorder. And so then the account would be refined over time. And the idea is that this is going to be a way of making explicit knowledge that we tacitly possess. And I guess the best known area of philosophy where this kind of method has been employed has been in epistemology. So epistemologists have worked for years trying to understand the concept of knowledge. So we're in debates about knowledge. We might start off thinking that maybe to know something just means that it's true and you believe it. But then we can say, well, what would we say about particular cases? So consider a case where somebody has a true belief, but it looks like they get to it by an unreliable method. So let's suppose that someone predicts the election results by reading tea leaves. We can say, well, would we consider that they knew the result? And probably we wouldn't. We'd think it was a lucky guess. And so then in the debates about knowledge, people suggest that for knowledge, someone needs to have a true belief that's also justified, and then you can go on and further complicate that. So that's the method, and it's understood in this research program in the philosophy of medicine, I think, to be a broadly descriptive project. What I mean by that is that the aim has been to understand how our current concept of disorder works. And so it might be that our ordinary ways of talking aren't completely consistent. So a successful account of disorder might need to tidy up our current practices a bit to make them consistent. But I guess the ideal end of this project would be that someone would come up with an account of what it is for something to be a disorder, some set of necessary and sufficient conditions, and then they explained that to the rest of the language community, the rest of us. Ideally, if they were right, we'd kind of recognize it. We'd say, oh yes, that's what I was getting at, something like that. Okay, so this is a project which has been going on since at least the 1970s. And at least until comparatively recently, the way the arguments went is that there were two main camps. So on the one side, there was Christopher Bors. And Christopher Bors famously thinks that whether or not something's a disorder depends entirely on matters of scientific fact. So he thinks that it's just a matter of biological fact whether or not someone has a disorder. And then on the other side of this debate were a gang of philosophers who thought that Bors was wrong and that value judgments are also involved. So Jerome Wakefield would be the best known. So Jerome Wakefield thinks that something is only a disorder if it's a harmful dysfunction. Other people, including myself, have variations on that sort of idea, the idea that harm is involved for something to be a disorder. And at least until very recently, it seemed to me quite clear that some kind of value-laden approach was going to be right. So many of you will know that homosexuality used to be considered a disorder, and then that became increasingly controversial in the late 60s, early 70s. 1973, the American Psychiatric Association had a vote and decided that they weren't going to consider homosexuality a disorder anymore. And I think that serves as a kind of test case. So the causal origins of homosexuality are unknown. For anyone knows, it might turn out that there's some kind of biological dysfunction involved, but even if that were the case, it's kind of irrelevant. So the key thing about homosexuality, which makes people think that it can't be a disorder, is that it's not harmful. So it's because it can be found to be gay that homosexuality was declassified. So it looks like that's potentially an example of something where it might or might not be some kind of dysfunction, but insofar as it's not harmful, it's not considered a disorder, and that goes with the way the value-laden accounts would predict. So this is something I've been kind of working on for a long time. So everything seemed to be going kind of well. You know, it looked to me that some sort of account of disorder whereby something had to be harmful to be a disorder was surely right, and it was just a matter of working out the details. But then more recently, I think that the project, understood as a descriptive project, as trying to unpick what our current concept of disorder is, has run into problems. And the problem is this. So the problem is that I think that mental health researchers and clinicians have changed the way that they classify and speak. So after the debates about homosexuality until comparatively recently, I think there was a broad consensus amongst mental health researchers and clinicians that something could only be a disorder if it was harmful. So you'll know that the DSM is this classification of mental disorders, and that has a definition of disorder in the introduction. And that required, for example, that something could only be a disorder if it caused harm, and lots of the sets of diagnostic criteria had a requirement that there was harm before someone could be diagnosed. But then what happened in 2013 is that there was a change, and that's dated very specifically. So that's when the latest edition of the DSM came out. So in the DSM-5, the definition of disorder changed such that it's no longer necessary for something to be harmful for it to be considered that someone has a mental disorder. And this change is interesting in that this is a change that seems to have been proposed quite late in the revision process that led up to the DSM-5. So when the DSM-5 is revised, that's a process that takes a very long time. So various draft proposals get made public and discussed. In 2011, there was a draft version of the DSM-5 that was made available. And in that draft, there were two competing definitions of disorder. One of the definitions had it that a mental disorder was some kind of dysfunction. So that's an account, something like Balls's account. The other definition had it that something could only be a mental disorder if there was a dysfunction, but it was also harmful. So something more like a value, fitting more with a value-laden kind of account. And what was interesting is that this was quite a late draft because the DSM takes so long to produce. So fairly much everything had been decided by this point, like what conditions were going in it, what the sets of diagnostic criteria were going to look like. And then at this point, there were these two competing definitions, and there was a note saying that a final decision would be made later on. And I think that the fact that these two definitions were even proposed shows that the consensus that I think had been there, that something could only be a disorder if it was harmful, was somehow breaking down. So just to say a little bit about where these two definitions came from. So the value-laden definition, the definition that required there to be harm, I think was coming out still from the tradition that had developed following the debates about homosexuality. The value-free definition came from a group who were interested in disability studies and coming out of a tradition there. So in disability studies, a distinction gets drawn between impairment, which is supposed to be a brute biological fact, like the fact that someone hasn't got any legs, and disability, which is supposed to be a value-laden term, but where the harm is produced by society. So there were these two groups who developed these two competing definitions. What happened in the end is that the definition was changed. So this definition's quite long. Basically, though, the bit before the usually associated in red, that's saying that there's some kind of dysfunction. The bit after it is saying that there's harm, but you've got this usually associated. So you've got this idea that a mental disorder is some kind of dysfunction that's usually associated with harm. And I guess as someone who's used to looking at accounts and definitions developed by philosophers, this looks kind of horrible to me. So it looks to me like this is some kind of fairly crass compromise between the two definitions that were proposed. I think it's quite hard to make out what you're supposed to take from this. But the reason I'm focusing on this is that I think the fact that these two competing definitions were proposed and then the final definition shows that it's no longer clear when you look at the DSM that there is this consensus that something has to be harmful to be a disorder anymore. So prior to the DSM-5 debate, I think it had seemed that mental health professionals tacitly held a value-laden account of disorder. They seemed to agree that something could only be a disorder if it caused harm. But now things look less certain. I'm not too sure exactly what to say. I don't know whether it's best to say that they used to have a value-laden account, but then they changed their minds, or whether it's like that their thinking was always being pretty loose and messy, maybe such a mess that there's no real clear implicit view there to be unearthed, but there seems to have been some kind of shift. Now, you might think that maybe I'm making too much of a fuss about the definition at the start of the DSM, because you might say, well, maybe psychiatrists just aren't very good at writing definitions. So one of the things that's striking about the change that was made to the definition in the DSM is that it was made quite late on in the revision process and there wasn't really very much debate. But I think there's also some additional evidence that suggests that there's been some kind of change in the concept of disorder. So I think that there's also evidence that there's been a shift in the way that concrete cases are classified and get spoken about. And I think this is particularly clear with conditions like tic disorders. So tic disorders are conditions like Tourette's, where people have involuntary motor movements and they might say things. And the key thing about tic disorders is that there's quite a lot of people who tic, but they don't care. It doesn't bother them, they might not have noticed, but researchers can look at them and see that they tic. Now, under the DSM-4, someone who ticked, but where it didn't cause them any problems, couldn't be diagnosed as having a disorder. It would just be that they just ticked, but that wouldn't be considered a disorder. With the DSM-5, things have changed. So now they can be said to have a disorder, even if it doesn't cause any problems. And also the way that research papers are changed. The way that research papers are written seems to have shifted, such that now people will talk about benign tic disorders, but still as being disorders, even though they don't cause any harm. So I think that there has been some kind of change. And I think this causes major problems for philosophers who've been engaged in a descriptive project which is aimed to describe how the current concept of disorder works. So basically the problem is that a few years ago, it looked like accounts according to which harm was necessary were the clear winners. And now there's been a shift such that that's no longer so clear. So it's no longer always accepted that harm's necessary for a condition to be a disorder. I want to move away from thinking about disorder just very, very briefly. So I think when it comes to the concept of disorder, there's been a shift in the way people speak. It might not be that unusual. There might be quite a lot of our concepts that are historically volatile and changing. So over the last few decades, a number of philosophers have looked at conceptual change. So Joseph Laporte's got a fantastic book, Natural Kinds and Conceptual Change. He's writing about the way that natural kind concepts sometimes have to be revised in the light of new scientific discoveries. So he talks about how concepts like rodent or chemical kind concepts get revised in the light of empirical discoveries. Sometimes concepts might be revised as a consequence of political renegotiation. So Ludlow discusses the case of rape. I don't know exactly how it is in Canada, but in the UK, until quite recently, a husband couldn't rape his wife. Whereas now the idea of marital rape makes sense. So there's been a shift in the concept there. And then Dorr and Hawthorne discuss some cases where it looks like concepts change over time, but it doesn't look like anyone particularly intended them to change. They just sort of shift over time when people aren't kind of paying attention. So they give the example of salad. So these days you can get all kinds of salads, like grapefruit salads, orange salads. Dorr and Hawthorne say that in the past, something could only be a salad if it was green and leafy. So it looks like there's quite a lot of our concepts that do change over time. And it might be that humankind terms might be particularly vulnerable to rapid change. So lots of you will be familiar with the work of Ian Hacking. Ian Hacking thinks that the terms that get used in the human sciences can change their meaning quite quickly. Basically, it's because people care how they're classified. So if you think of disability terms, gender terms, race terms, these all become contested. They all seem to change over time. And that's because they get caught up with people protesting or trying to advance various political objectives, and that leads to them changing quite rapidly. So if you think about Quine on the virtues that are supposed to govern kind of conceptual revision, Quine focuses on simplicity, consistency, conservatism. But when it comes to humankind terms, it looks like moral and political disputes also play a role, and that might generate more rapid changes. So I think that the concept of disorder has been on the move. I think that there might be quite a lot of concepts, particularly to do with human beings, where they're on the move. And this poses a challenge for people interested in conceptual analysis. So the basic problem is that people engaged in descriptive conceptual analysis, they're trying to understand how our concepts work. They're trying to unpick our concepts. They're aiming at getting some set of necessary and sufficient conditions. But even if they succeed in finding some necessary condition, it looks like that might not keep being a necessary condition for all that long. So I think that harm used to be necessary for disorder, but that maybe it no longer is. Now, something that I kind of fudge is that I'm not too clear what the individuation criteria for concepts ought to be. So I don't know, I think there's been some kind of conceptual change. I don't know whether we ought to say that the one concept of disorder has changed, or whether there's a series of successor concepts. So I don't have clear views about that. I don't think it matters too much. The basic idea is that there's some kind of change going on, such that harm might be necessary for something to be a disorder at one point in time, and then 10 years later, it just isn't anymore. So the question is what to do. So I'm going to discuss 3 possible courses of action. So we might give up, we might go revisionary, or we might do, so I'm going to talk about belting and bracing conceptual claims. So the first and most obvious option would just be to give up on projects of descriptive conceptual analysis, just abandon attempts to try to get an account of disorder. So Ereshefsky and Heslow have both suggested that philosophers who are trying to get an account of disorder are kind of wasting their time. They both say, look, people have been working on this project for ages, they're not really getting anywhere. and they both think that many of the most interesting philosophical questions could be addressed without worrying about what conditions are disorders, without worrying about developing a general account of disorder. So they think that very often the reason why people get caught up in worrying about whether something's a disorder or not is because they're interested in various ethical or political or empirical questions, and they think we could cut out the step of worrying about whether something's a disorder at all. So, for example, we might ask under what kinds of situations, what kinds of circumstances it's morally legitimate to take mind-altering drugs. And we could address questions like that without worrying about various states of disorders or not, they think. Or we might focus directly on the question of what kinds of state can serve as excuses, without going via the question of whether something's a disorder or not. So that'd be one way to go, just to give up on trying to get a descriptively adequate account of disorder. Now, I'm not particularly keen on that. The reason I'm not particularly keen on just giving up on trying to unpick our concept of disorder is that I think our concept of disorder is part of a network of concepts. So I think our current concept of disorder has links to how we think about medical practice, how we think about recovery, how we think about neediness, how we think about excuse and responsibility, and so on. And my hope is, in trying to unpick our concepts of disorder and work out how it works, is that it might shed light on this network of concepts and address some quite general kinds of questions. So, for example, I'd hope that by analysing the concepts of disorder, we might get some understanding of who the relevant authorities might be when it comes to identifying disorders or identifying those conditions that mean that people deserve to be treated or excused and so on. So that's why I'm not particularly keen on just giving up. The second option is that one might go revisionary. So far I've been talking about descriptive conceptual analysis. So I've been talking about the attempts of philosophers who are trying to understand how our current concepts work. And historical variation causes them problems because they might say that harm is necessary for disorder, and they might be right if they're writing in the year 2000, and then 20 years down the line it's just changed. Now, if you change to revisionary projects, you don't need to worry about that as much. In a revisionary project, you're not interested in understanding our current concepts and how they work. What you're doing is you're creating or revising concepts that will best fit your purposes. So you might be trying to create concepts that will facilitate better scientific research, or you might try to create concepts to enable political progress. And I guess Sally Haslinger would be the best known example of someone who thinks that we might revise certain concepts to facilitate political progress. So she talks about ameliorative conceptual projects. The idea there is that we might revise our concepts to enable political progress. Now, if we were thinking about disorder, if we were to go revisionary, what we'd do is we wouldn't worry about our current concepts of disorder. Instead, we'd consider what concepts would be most useful. So we'd switch to asking, well, how ought we to think about disorder? And you can imagine various different projects. So you might be interested in thinking about what concepts will be best for various types of medical research projects. You might be interested in what concepts might be best for various political projects. There might be some projects where a value-laden account might fit quite nicely. So if you think about, so there are some people with Asperger's, for example, where they might say that they're perfectly happy as they are, they just want to be left alone. Now, if you were to adopt an account of disorder that says that something can only be a disorder if it's harmful, then that might fit with the aims of certain groups of people with Asperger's quite nicely, because if you say that something's only a disorder if it's harmful, then if some people with Asperger's are perfectly happy as they are, then they just don't count as having a disorder. And then the question of whether they require treatment or something ought to be done just doesn't really arise. But my concern is that I think that the political consequences and also the consequences for scientific research projects can be unpredictable kind of down the line. So if you think of the case where you might have a group of people with Asperger's who might think that having an account of disorder where something's only a disorder if it causes harm might be quite useful, but it might have knock-on implications that are unpredictable. So you can imagine, for example, that if you say that Asperger's isn't a disorder because it doesn't cause harm, then that might make it harder to claim various disability benefits or to or for it to serve sometimes as an excuse in legal contexts and so on. So my worry with revisionary projects is that if you go in for revising our concepts to best fit with scientific research or with political projects, then what's going to count as the best definition is going to depend on exactly what your project is, and it's going to depend on the context of use. And I think that what is actually going to end up being best can be hard to predict. And I think that the difficulties of prediction are particularly acute when it comes to thinking about how we might go about revising what I'm going to call coordinating concepts. And so I think that disorder is an example of a coordinating concept. What I mean by that is that at the moment it's a concept that serves a role in coordinating various different types of practice. So at the moment, we think of disorders as being diagnosed by medics. Researchers investigate cures and treatments and so on, but those same conditions that get diagnosed by medics also tend to justify treatment services, and they play a role in legal situations as well. So something like the concept of disorder plays a role in coordinating various different types of practice. And that means if you revise it to suit one particular purpose, it's likely to have knock-on consequences which are unpredictable. So that's my worry with revisionary projects. I'm not completely against them, but I'd have reservations in engaging in them myself, because I think it's so hard to predict what concepts actually are going to end up being best for particular purposes. So the idea that I want to pursue is this third option. So the basic problem is that the conceptual analyst is aiming at finding a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. But if they do manage to find some necessary condition for a concept to be applied, the necessity is clearly weak. So it depends on the current consensus of a linguistic community, and they can just change their mind. So what I'm looking for is a way of kind of analysing concepts which is going to be robust in the face of at least some future conceptual change. And so I'm going to put forward this idea that we might belt and brace conceptually based claims. So the idea with belting and bracing is that, so people talk about belting and bracing your trousers. So the idea is that if you really want your trousers to stay up, but you don't completely trust your belt and you don't completely trust your braces, then if you use both, then hopefully at least something will keep your trousers up. So I want to explore something analogous. So the thought is that sometimes it might be possible to make a conceptually based claim on the basis of a number of more or less independent considerations. And then the thought is that even if one necessary conceptual connection gives way, the others can be hoped to hold. So I've talked about belting and bracing. This is another metaphor. So it used to be that people who climbed up rock faces only tried to climb up stable rock. And if you climb up stable rock, what you do is you climb up and you put in a bit of metal equipment and you put it in a secure location and you put your rope up and it should all be okay. If you want to climb on rock, which is unstable, then there's a different technique. So this is a quote from Andy Kirkpatrick, who's a climber. He says, the rule in these situations is to build an anchor with as many pieces as you can, then lash the whole disaster together in order to construct one good piece, then pray. And you've got a picture of how he uses this technique. So what you've got here is you've got lots of bits of metal equipment put into the rock face, and then the rope is linked to all of them. And it's set up like this in the expectation that some of these bits of metal might give way, but the hope is that enough will hold so that you don't hit the ground. So going back to disorder, the major dispute when people have been arguing over accounts of disorder has been to do with whether it's only biological facts that are involved in figuring out whether something's a disorder or not, or whether moral and political values also play a role. And what I want to claim is that our current concept of disorder is shaped by ethical and political values in very many semi-independent ways. And that means that even if our concept does shift a bit in the future, it's likely to still be value-laden in at least some ways, at least in the kind of medium term. So I used to think that there was a very direct connection between ethical and political values and something being a disorder. So I think it used to be the case that something could only be a disorder if it was harmful. I've talked a bit about how that very direct link might be giving way when we've looked at the revisions to the DSM and in the way that people talk about tic disorders. But I mean, it might be that the DSM goes back the other way. So it might be that that direct link might kind of firm up again, but it's currently at least questionable. But I think that values also play a role indirectly in determining what's going to count as a disorder. So I think that for something to count as a disorder, the person with it has got to be unlucky, or it's got to be unusual or unexpected, something in that ballpark. And the ethical and political values play a role in determining how unlucky someone has to be. And I think it's also the case that with our current concept of disorder, disorders are located within people. And I'm going to argue that ethical and political values play a role there. And there might be other links as well. So I think, for example, that we currently distinguish between moral failings and disorders, and the ethical and political values might well play a role there as well. But the thought is that ethical and political values end up playing a role over and over again, such that even if there is some change in our concepts, it's still going to be value-laden one way or another. So just to flesh that out a little bit. So I think that for something to be a disorder, it's got to be somewhat unusual or unexpected, or the person's got to be unlucky. And then the question is, well, how unlucky? What I've got for you here is 3 examples of disorders where they occur at the tail end of a normal distribution. So intellectual disability, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and hypertension. And in these 3 cases, the proportion of the population who's thought to be disordered is radically different. So only 2% of people are thought of as having intellectual disability, but about 40% of people are said to have hypertension. So a straightforward statistical account won't work in saying how unlucky you've got to be to count as having a disorder. rather what I think is going on here is that there's a kind of cost-benefit analysis done in locating the threshold for each condition. So roughly, with intellectual disability, there's nothing much that can be done about it. So there's no advantage in considering lots and lots of people to have intellectual disability. Whereas with hypertension, there's cheap and moderately successful treatments around, so it makes sense to count a whole load more people as having a disorder. So the thought I've got is that it's part of our concepts of disorder that you have to be unlucky, and that you need to be unlucky enough such that it kind of seems that you're sort of hard done by, and that it's worth trying to do something about your state, and that where the threshold gets put depends on political and moral and economic considerations. It's kind of cost-benefit analysis. And then I also think that ethical and political values play an indirect role in making sense of the idea that disorders are internal. So I think that we distinguish between disorders and environmental problems. So disorders are thought of as being a problem within the individual, whereas environmental problems are thought to be a problem without. And I've put the in here in kind of scare quotes. So I think roughly what goes on here in lots of cases is it's a judgment that depends on what we think ought to be changed. So if we think that the environment ought to be changed to solve a problem, then we locate the problem as being within the environment. If we think that the individual ought to be changed, then we locate the problem within the individual. I've got some examples for you here. These are all physical examples just because it's easier to see what's going on. Though I think you can also get analogous issues when you're thinking about psychological conditions and the fit with the environment. Now, the 5 examples I've got for you here, they're all in a sense relational problems, in that they can all be dealt with by altering the environment or by altering the individual, but we think of them very differently. So if you're a small woman, as I am, lots of the world isn't designed to accommodate you very well. So, you know, like there are steps that are too big, there are shelves that are too high, and so on. Now, in that case, I think it's fair enough to say that we live in an environment which is somewhat sexist, kind of structurally sexist, and that the environment ought to change. Similarly, if you think of the problems that are faced by a left-handed person dealing with equipment designed for right-handed people, we think in that case that the equipment ought to be changed. So in those cases, we'd blame the environment. We wouldn't think that the problem was within the small woman or the left-handed person. If you think about, so a person in an allergy bubble, so you know there are some people who are allergic to so many things that they kind of go around in a protective bubble. There, I think that even though the person's kind of okay in the allergy bubble, I think we don't consider that to be a kind of acceptable environmental accommodation. So there we think that the problem's within the person. Similarly, with someone who has to use a feeding tube, there we think that the problem is within the person. So my thought is that we conclude that there's nothing wrong with an individual if we think that it would be reasonable to alter the environment to sort out whatever problems they might face. And there again, it becomes an ethical and political kind of question. I've got the wheelchair user in the middle. So the wheelchair user is currently controversial. So with the social model of disability, there the claim is that the environment ought to change rather than the body of the wheelchair user. And so there, that brings out quite nicely how these are, at the end of the day, political arguments. So the thought is, I just find out where I'm up to. Almost finished. So the thought is that figuring out what counts as a disorder ends up depending on value judgments in many ways. So our concept of disorder is value-laden many times over. The domain of medicines isn't going to be settled by biological facts alone. And because there are so many conceptual links between ethical and political values and the concept of disorder, I'd expect that to be a result that is fairly robust, even if our concept does shift a bit, you know, like in the shortish to medium term. So that's it. So thank you very much. So thanks very much to the organisers and to you all for listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for this very nice talk. So I'm sure many of you have questions and comments for Professor Cooper. So I'm going to ask you to write in the chat that you have a question so that Sarah and I can take question, because we cannot see you if you raise your hand or if you click on the raising hand button. So
yes, we can start with Justin Carson.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you so much for that nice talk. I really learned a lot. I guess my question had to do with the way that you saw this sea change taking place in the understanding of mental disorder from a value-laden idea to a non-value-laden idea. And I guess I wasn't entirely convinced that the kind of evidence that you were citing really pointed to the kind of sea change that you were talking about. And one was with the Tourette's. I mean, I take it that in a lot of mental disorders like antisocial personality disorder or Tourette's, there may be a handful of people who have the condition and really don't care at all, and for whom it really doesn't disrupt their day-to-day life, their relationships, occupation. But I guess it seems to me that so long as, I mean, couldn't the proponent, I'm sorry, I'm still thinking this through, but couldn't the proponent of the value-laden view just say, look, so long as most people or the majority of people with this particular condition do suffer or do face some kind of a social disadvantage, that's enough to make it a disorder. You know, the fact that there are people with antisocial personality disorder who literally don't care and who don't seem to face any negative social repercussions, that doesn't somehow undermine the fact that these are still value-laden categories, that what it is in general to have antisocial personality disorder is to have some kind of a harmful dysfunction. I hope that's clear in what I said.
Yeah, no, thank you. So, so I guess a number of thoughts. Mm-hmm. So one is that, I mean, personality disorders have always been kind of controversial. Mm-hmm. So those are always, personality disorders are always going to be somewhat tricky cases. With the idea that with something like tic disorders, there's still some kind of link with harm, because surely most of the people suffer some kind of harm. I guess my feeling is that that's often unclear, because like the people who get diagnosed in clinics are only a subpopulation. Those are the people who turn up in general or get brought because people think there's a problem. So my understanding is that with tic disorders, particularly with small kids, when researchers go into classrooms, it turns out there's loads of kids that have tic disorders, like kind of at large, without realizing it. And so it might be that like maybe the majority of people with tic disorders aren't harmed by it. So those are just kind of little thoughts. I guess the more general thought is that, so fundamentally, I want to claim that ethical and political values are involved in fixing the concept of disorder. Now, if it's possible to say that there is just a very, very direct link, that it's still part of our concept, that at least most of the people with a condition have to be harmed by it, then I'm kind of quite happy with that. In some ways, what I'm proposing here is it's a kind of protective strategy. So I guess I've become worried with the debates about the DSM that our concept of disorder might be shifting. And then the question is, well, how, as someone interested in conceptual analysis, can we respond to areas where it looks like things maybe are uncertain and there might be some shifting going on?
Okay, thank you.
I have a next question from Awais Aftab.
Hi, thank you for the great talk. I also want to challenge the notion that there was a shift in sort of like DSM-5 with regards to the definition of mental disorder, particularly the balance between objective facts and values. So it is, you're correct that DSM-5 uses the term that sort of like these conditions are usually associated with distress or impairment. But if you look at the previous DSMs, in particular DSM-3, where the definition was first offered, the language there says that it is, instead of saying usually associated, it says typically associated. So even in DSM-3, where the definition of mental disorder was offered for the first time, it was not said, sort of like, at least it wasn't said clearly or explicitly that distress or disability is a necessity. The language even then was, it is typically associated. So, we're moving from a slight shift in language from typically associated to usually associated, which I'm not sure sort of like, if this contributes something very significant. A second thing is that we have the definition at the beginning of the manual, but then we also have the criteria for the individual conditions. And for the vast majority of those conditions, it also includes there's a criterion for clinically significant distress or impairment. So, the fact that vast majority of these conditions include that criterion sort of like suggests that distress or disability continues to play a very important role. Now, it's very interesting to look at the conditions which don't have that criterion. And there are only a handful of those conditions in the DSM-5, and all of them have the common theme that they are harmful to others. So these are conditions such as kleptomania, such as compulsive stealing, pyromania, compulsive fire setting. You can have certain sort of like certain forms of pedophilic disorder, again, harm to others, and certain forms of antisocial personality disorder. So even in the conditions in the DSM, which doesn't explicitly state that distress or impairment is a criterion, you still have these considerations of harm that are existing in the form of harm to others. So that was my second point. And the third is that DSM uses the word dysfunction, but it never defines what it is. In particular, it never says that dysfunction is intended to be a value-free, objective concept. And in fact, it could be argued, and many people have argued, that the notion of dysfunction that DSM uses is a folk psychological notion that is inherently value-laden. So I think all of these points, comparing the language DSM-3 versus DSM-5, looking at the individual conditions, and the sort of like looking at the context surrounding the word dysfunction, I don't think anything suggests that there is a shift from sort of like, value inclusive to value free happening within DSM-5.
Okay, thank you. So you're right. So the DSM-3 had a definition which is quite close to the DSM-5 one, although the DSM-5 one's a bit longer. But in the DSM-3, the link between dysfunction and harm, it was also typically or usually or something like that. Now, so I guess I'm tempted to see the DSM-3 as kind of a blip. So I think the DSM-3 definition came out of a definition that Spitzer came up with in a paper where he was interested in debates about homosexuality. And there he suggested that something had to be harmful to be a disorder. And then in the DSM-3R and the DSM-4, there the connection's a lot tighter. There it is that you have to have harm to have a disorder. So I take your point about the DSM-3. I guess I see that as a blip, because I guess I see the DSM-3 as coming out of Spitzer's work, where the link with harm was a lot closer. Then you have the DSM-3, which is a bit kind of fudged, like the DSM-5 is. But like in the DSM-4, I think there was a tighter link between harm and disorder in the introductory definition. When it comes to the sets of diagnostic criteria, I take your point that lots of those still require there to be some kind of harm before a condition to be diagnosed. I guess, so one thing I think is that the definition of disorder in the introduction only got changed very, very late on in the revision process. So I think that the sets of diagnostic criteria were fairly much all sorted, And then kind of at the last minute, there was this change to the definition in the introduction. And so I think as yet, at the moment, you're right. Most of the individual sets of diagnostic criteria include a harm requirement. I think that because there's been the change in the introduction, it's no longer clear whether those are going to be required going into the future. And also in the introduction, there is a bit where it says that, so there's a bit where it says that the committees have struggled to figure out where the thresholds ought to be set for various conditions. And that in some cases, the harm criteria was a kind of placeholder for some better way of doing that. So I guess I think that maybe there has been, I guess I think maybe there is a shift underway. In a sense, if it turns out that I'm wrong, I'm not too bothered. As in, so I guess I'm arguing, I see myself as arguing against people who think that you could have a purely scientific account of disorder. And so, and I'm worried by the possibility that there might be some shiftiness in the way that the concept of disorder is working. If it turns out that I'm panicking too early, and that, you know, as the DSM gets revised again, all these requirements for harm do stay in place, and maybe the definition goes back to what it used to be, then in a way, you know, I'd be kind of quite happy with that.
Thank you.
So next question is from Shane Glacking.
Hi, thanks, Rachel. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed when I read the original paper, so it's great to have a chance to actually ask about it. I'm sympathetic to your overall project and to the overall view, but I just have a sort of methodological puzzle about the evidence for thinking that there's a conceptual shift. I don't think this duplicates the previous question too much, but so when we want evidence about a concept, what we usually take as being evidence is pre-theoretical intuitions. And so either philosophers will joust about thought experiments that are supposed to show the intuitions so obviously that even theoretically invested professional readers can convince themselves the reaction is theory-free. Or we go and do an empirical study that asks the folk in some nebulous sense who don't have any theoretical horse in the race what they think, and we get the pre-theoretical intuitions that way. So it looks like what you're doing is taking that sort of empirical evidence, an observational study rather than the X-Fi style controlled experiment, but it's evidence from people who are partisans, right? You're not dealing with the pre-theoretical folk. You're dealing with people who have settled ideas, and in the case of the DSM committees, who probably have quite firm ideas that they've argued about among themselves as to what the correct definition is. So I'm just kind of wondering why that counts as evidence that a shift is going on in the concept, as opposed to a squabble is going on among some partisans.
No, thank you. So I guess I'm tempted to think that lay people quite often do seem to defer to mental health professionals and to the DSM as kind of experts in this area. So, so for example, hoarding disorder was included in the DSM-5 for the first time. And now I think if you read kind of newspaper reports and how people now speak, people just seem to kind of go along with that. So I think our current practices are such that there's a fair amount of deference to books like the DSM. And then also partly I'm struggling to know what to use as evidence. So I guess I think for definite. So for definite, I think the DSM committees are important linguistic community, if you're thinking about the concept of disorder, and it's kind of it's easy to see what they think because they write it all down. Now, if lay people used the term disorder somewhat differently, I'll be very interested in that. But I myself, like actually doing empirical investigation. So I know some people do kind of experimental philosophy and go and ask people. Like that's a lot of work and I'm too lazy. So it's like if other people did that, I'd be really interested. But I haven't done that. So in my defense, I think that the DSM committees are at least a significant population. I think there is a fair amount of deference to, they're perceived as experts in this area. If lay people did use the terms differently, I'd be very interested. It's not like I'm against those kind of empirical studies, but I haven't got like the resources or ability to do that kind of stuff myself at the moment.
The next question is from Christopher Nielsen.
Hi there. Thanks for the talk, Rachel. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I guess I'm going to take a slightly different route to some of the other questions and take the fact that the concept is changing as kind of a given. And I guess my question falls into two parts. Firstly, I really loved the imagery of this multiple points of necessity within the concept of disorder. But the first part of the question, I guess, is that I wonder how this idea ultimately differs from a kind of Roschian concept, because it seems to change the nature of necessity. It makes it very blurry. I'm not sure, the solidness that you get with clear, necessary, and sufficient conditions disappears. And then the second part of the question, I guess, is given that, doesn't that kind of weaken the purpose of the descriptive project? If we're just making our description messy enough to fit its use, then what does the description give us? And that's probably stemming from the fact that I'm just, I don't know why, implicitly more of seeking to, I lean more towards that revisionary approach, that option 2 you gave. I was just wondering if you could speak around, the purpose of the descriptive project in your eyes, if that makes sense.
So just to bring out where I think the differences are with Roschian concepts. So I don't know if people are familiar with Roschi's stuff, but I take it that's similar to a kind of Wittgensteinian family resemblance type idea. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that you can have like prototypical birds which kind of fly and are kind of feathery and little. And lots of birds are kind of like that, but some aren't, like penguins and ostriches. They count as less birdy because they don't have all of the standard features of birds, even though we still group them in that. Now, I guess I see what I'm suggesting as being somewhat different in that. So with these necessary connections, so they are weak in a sense in that our practices can change so that what is necessary at one point in time can just cease to be so. But my picture is that so they're not particularly secure, but mm-hmm. they all stay, they kind of go, if they're in place, they're applied to all conditions at a particular point in time. So I guess I think, so my view is that like 15 years ago, I think that it was conceptually necessary for something to be harmful, for it to be a disorder, and that applied across the board. Whereas now I'm less certain that's in place. So that's kind of where I see the difference there. Now you're kind of saying that revisionary projects are just like a lot better.
My own bias.
So I guess, I talked about one concern I have about revisionary projects, that I think if you're a revisionary, then your ambition is to come up with the best definition or the best concepts. And I think that predicting what's going to be the best can be very difficult. So I think that conceptual engineering can have unintended consequences that we might not like down the line. So that's one worry. And the other worry I've got is that I see revisionary projects as being in some way too ambitious. Because like in a revisionary project, it's like you get some philosopher writing an obscure paper, saying, hey guys, let's change the way we talk. And And I guess I don't see philosophers in general as having that much kind of influence. So, but what I guess I think I'm trying to do, so I want to understand how our concept works. I'm going to try to argue that it's ethically and politically loaded over and over again. And then the kind of thing I think I'm going to be able to do with that is fairly modest. But for example, in disputes over kind of medicalization, so there are some people, so someone like Bors, for example, is going to think that there are lines in nature as to, you know, whether something's a disorder or not, and the way to figure that out is going to be looking at kind of scientific facts. I'm going to argue that it's an ethical and political kind of debate. And so then also I'm going to end up thinking that medics aren't absolute authorities in saying what counts as a disorder. It's going to become something more for negotiation amongst a bigger group. So it's not yeah, so that's my game.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. That definitely answers the question. Thanks.
Next question from Richard Saville Smith.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you very much for your lovely talk. I enjoyed that a lot. I was wondering if you've spent much time in the world of dissociative identity disorder in DSM-5, because the DSM-5 introduced the idea of disruption, and disruption becomes a placeholder where something might or might not be a disorder, depending on whether it's a normal part of a broadly accepted cultural or religious practice.
Mm.
And if you think about that for long enough, what you find is that psychiatry is effectively opting out of the question of how to construct disorder, and rather allowing other people from the world of culture and religious studies to determine whether something might be a normal part of a broadly accepted cultural or religious practice. And I think you might find that's quite interesting, the concept of
Yeah, so you get a similar thing with delusions. So basically you end up with a difficulty in the you don't want to say, like, so that if a belief is culturally typical, then it's not going to be classed as a delusion. And the same thing, so this is what you're talking about, is to cover kind of trance experiences and so on, I think.
Well, possession, particularly.
Yeah,
possession.
so as they occur as in particular kind of cultural groups.
Yeah.
And I think you're right there, that very probably it's going to come down to a judgment as to kind of like what's expectable under the cultural circumstances, or something.
But what's interesting about it though is that because the DSM-5 is the output of a bunch of committees, obviously, is that you have that within dissociative identity disorder, but it doesn't, for instance, make it over into schizophrenia, where there's actually quite a lot of the same ambiguities sometimes.
Mm. Yes, no, thank you. Yes, you're right that that's going to be another area where, you know, considerations of what's kind of judged to be reasonable or kind of appropriate end up playing a major role.
Mm. Thank you.
Next question from Carly Frieders.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much for that lovely talk. And my question is, this is something I want to pose on behalf of the person who maybe says, and you discussed this earlier in your talk, maybe we don't need to understand or have a solid conception of what disorder is. And maybe there are all these other sorts of interesting questions we can pursue about, you know, when medicine should be used or when people should be held responsible, without answering that question of what a disorder is. And you say that you don't agree with that because you think that the disorder is kind of tied up within this network of concepts. So maybe by, you know, illuminating our concept of disorder will illuminate those other concepts as well. And I can definitely see how that would be the case if we assume that, you know, maybe like just to take one example, like maybe there's something essential to being a disorder that is also essential to having some impairment that makes you not responsible, or essential to having an excuse, I guess. But I guess I could imagine, or someone could make an argument at least, that it could be the case that there's just, you know, maybe a very contingent relationship between disorder and excuses. So like, as one example, someone could argue that maybe like a disorder just is anything that causes a person harm or distress. And maybe a lot of the things that cause people harm and distress do so by disrupting their epistemic rationality, but not always. Maybe that's one way that, you know, something causes someone distress. And maybe impairments to epistemic rationality are one thing that can be an excuse in mental responsibility. So, or when we're thinking about moral responsibility. So sorry, that's kind of a long-winded route to the point I'm trying to make, but I guess I'm just saying that, you know, if maybe it's not the case that having a disorder automatically or essentially excuses people, it just happens to be that a lot of times having a disorder excuses people. Couldn't we then say that, you know, we don't really need to understand exactly what that concept of disorder is to answer these other questions about responsibility? And I could imagine a similar argument being advanced, you know, in terms of thinking about when treatment is appropriate, when involuntary treatment is appropriate, all these other questions that we sometimes assume we need to have that concept nailed down for.
Yeah, so thank you. So I guess my thought is that so I guess I think that our current practices as such, that there are ties between someone having a disorder and them being eligible for an SA extension or medical treatment or legal excuses in it. And so I think that's the way our current practices go. But I take your point that on analysis, our concept of disorder, lots of these our practices might need revising at the end of the day. So I guess my starting point is that I think our concept of disorder does play a role in a network of concepts. And I want to unpick the concept of disorder to try to get clear on what makes us think that something's a disorder or not. At the end of the day, I think you're probably right, and that lots of our practices probably are just confused. So I think once we unpick the concept of disorder, it's going to be very hard to justify the way in which currently in various practices we tend to kind of help people with disorders more than we do people who are disadvantaged by poverty, or, you know, because they can't have a job or educational problems or whatever. So I guess the reason I want to try and unpick the concept of disorder is because I think it currently plays a role in governing the ways that our societies operate. Though at the end of the day, it might be that some of our practices don't really make sense and need to be revised. So I guess I think my worry with Ereshevsky and Heslow is that I think they're moving too quickly to get rid of the concept of disorder. And so this again goes to my concern about kind of revisionary projects. So I think you can understand their project as kind of being revisionary. So rather than saying let's alter the concept of disorder, they're saying let's just get rid of it. And my worry is partly kind of that philosophers don't really have that kind of power, that like the concept of disorder is in action at the moment. And so what I want to do is to unpick and understand that.
So just to note that there are some written comments on the chat, and so maybe after the questions, if there's still time, we can, Rachel Cooper, if you want to read them, it's, or if people that are writing them want us to read them out loud, you can let me know as well. But otherwise, next question would go to Tuomas Vesterinen.
Hi. Hi, Rachel. Thank you for a very interesting talk. My question is, I'm sort of concerned, like I guess other people have already mentioned this in a way, why do you think that the DSM gets to decide what the concept is? I mean, why is it that you rely so much on the DSM's definition of the necessary and sufficient provide for the DSM provide the necessary and sufficient conditions on what mental disorders would constitute of? I mean, wouldn't you think wouldn't one be able to claim, for instance, that the linguistic community doesn't share maybe the DSM's conception, and what kind of implications would that have on your account? But furthermore, I have another question related to this. So even if we were to agree that DSM gets to decide what mental disorders are, wouldn't that sort of still be a value judgment that the DSM would be doing, in the sense that even if they don't think so anymore by themselves, in the sense that following your own work, that the concept of mental disorders is not a natural kind? And the way I understand from your previous work, what you mean by this is that, or at least one could claim that it's constituted by values, the concept of mental disorder, not just causally determined by values. Or would you disagree with this interpretation of your work?
So I guess I do think I do think that the DSM is hugely culturally significant, in that I think that, you know, if you read things that are written for lay people or newspaper reports and so on, I think there is a massive social deference to the DSM. So the DSM does get cited as a kind of authority for what gets considered a disorder or not. Similarly, when it comes to like the design of medical curricula and how textbooks are written, I think that lots of those do kind of follow the DSM approach. So yeah, so I guess I'm tempted to think that the DSM is massively significant. Now, it might not be so significant always or in every part of the world. But I mean, I guess thinking about the kind of source, the discussions about mental health in the UK, it does seem to me that people are willing to defer to the DSM a very great deal. So I guess I take it as an example. So when people talk about scientific concepts in general, you've got this idea that there's often you know, a division of linguistic labour, and that people just defer to experts when it comes to natural kind terms or what are thought to be natural kind terms. I guess I'd see it as a case of where something like that was going on. Sorry. Now then, with reference to my earlier stuff, sorry. So I did used to think that, so I previously I've written stuff where I've named that disorder just is a value-laden term. Now recently I've become more hesitant because I was really upset with these changes with the DSM. You know, it seemed to me that I'd been quite happily bashing away developing a value-laden account, and then it looked to me like there was some significant change in the way that people were thinking. And one thing I haven't talked about actually is, so I think there has been a shift in how the DSM talks about disorder, and that the link with harm and disorder has been weakened. I think also when it comes to how people talk about disability, there's been a shift as well. In that when it comes to discussions about disability, there are people who will say that there are various disabilities that that are good or neutral. And I guess I think that's a shift as well. So like 20 years ago, if people who are deaf, say, were quite happy being deaf, then they'd phrase that as saying that being deaf isn't a disability, because it would have been thought that, you know, disability was essentially bad, whereas that's another area where I think there's been a shift. So you're right that I used to write stuff saying that for something to be a disorder, it had to be harmful. The reason I've changed is that I saw myself as engaged in a descriptive project. And I guess I think that the way that various linguistic communities are talking is changing. And so I've got to change my stuff too.
Okay, we'll take, yes. Sorry, did you have a very, very quick follow-up?
Oh, yes, it concerned the other question. So even if DSM gets to decide what the concept is, wouldn't they still make value adjustments, in the sense that they would draw the difference between what's pathological and what's normal? So it would be constituted by values. Even if they claim that it's not based on values, it would still be value-laden. I mean, just wouldn't Cooper agree with this based on her account?
Yes, so I guess I'm trying to say that they are going to have to be drawing on ethical judgments and political judgments at various points. And so I think you can see that when it comes to determining where the thresholds of disorder are going to be, for example.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, there are last two questions. Sonia Alari.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, all right. Hi, Rachel. Thank you for the talk. It's a pleasure to see and hear you again. Well, about the disorder thing, I think I'm more of an abolitionist about this. Not that I want to give up totally the disorder concept, but if you look at the medical domain, we don't have only medical disorders. There's medical conditions, you have anomalies, you have dysfunctions, you have disabilities. And I'm wondering why it couldn't be the same in psychiatry. I mean, yeah, there's the example you said in the part about giving up the definition of a disorder, where you talk about in what kind of case it's legitimate to improve life with mind-altering drugs. And there, just by asking why you would have to improve somebody's life with these drugs, would it be for survival, for comfort, or for to conform inside a society? It gives you another distinctions about the different points. You think about if something is not harmful anymore or not problematic anymore for the person, do they still have the disorder? So I'm thinking maybe we should not necessarily give up the part about disorders, but let's say take every condition that is in the DSM, and maybe they should be just reclassified, and maybe we'll have to keep the term disorder, but maybe it will be just let's say a subclass, because like in medicine, where we would have different kind of, well, I like the word condition because it's more like it can talk about anything as simple as being left-handed, that can be maybe an anomaly, but it's also, you can see that people can also suffer from it from a social perspective, with religious stuff, that the left hand is the devil's hand. You have all these little things, but there will be also conditions that are mostly social, because when I don't remember who talked about the need for harm, about the condition that harms others, because these might be seen as totally social. If it may be really controversial to think about pedophilia as being maybe something natural in the animal kingdom, but being a social species that really developed way beyond other animal species, it has become a disorder. So I would like your view about how we could classify in by taking example with the medical field that will have all these little bubbles.
So so I think so I said at the outset that so I guess I see myself as contributing to a kind of research program which has been ongoing kind of in philosophy of medicine, philosophy of psychiatry, where people have focused on disorder or disease as a kind of umbrella concept. So, you know, putting together diseases, disabilities, wounds, all in together. I guess I think that quite a lot of our practices are such that we currently lump all kinds of pathological state in together, in the whether it's an injury or a disease or a disability. We think that people kind of ought to be eligible for medical treatment. Anything like that will get you an essay extension or whatever it might be. So I guess I think that there is kind of an umbrella concept where we do consider everything together. And so I think it's worthwhile philosophers analysing that concept. But I take your point that making finer divisions and also having classes of things like conditions, say, or risk states, where they're not considered disorders, but they're kind of in the same sort of ballpark-ish, might well be useful for various types of practice. So I agree with you that there will be interesting things to be said about finer grained concepts and about things that aren't kind of considered disorders, but where medics still kind of take an interest in them. But I still want to defend the idea that looking at what I'm calling the umbrella concept is worthwhile, and I think it does play a role in some of our practices, and that's really what I'm looking at the moment.
So it will be the last question for today. Julio Ozores.
Oh, I can't hear you. You've got your mute on.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for that very clear talk. It was wonderful. I wanted to ask you something that takes you a little bit afield from the question of values or harm. You know, I wonder about conditions like antisocial personality disorder. They are it's universally, I would say, seen as harmful, even though the afflicted person may not actually be in distress. But quite aside from that, considering it as a disorder, would demand that there will be a dysfunction. And of course, that's not the topic. Your interest is in values, I gather, and not in dysfunction. But it strikes me as that even the concept of dysfunction is a changeable value, maybe value-laden, because there is this idea that antisocial personality could be considered a quite adaptive parasitic strategy that happens when there is a complex social cooperation. So yeah, and we might indeed be interested and be rightfully motivated to try to control it, to treat it, but it would not be a disorder. And regardless of the question of harm, but even the question of dysfunction is contentious. So it's a little bit far afield from your topic, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on that question.
So, so my own view is that so there are competing accounts of function. They all end up, I think, running into difficulties. I guess my view is that that's kind of someone else's problem. In that, so one thing I'm sure of is I'm sure that saying that something's a dysfunction isn't going to be sufficient to show that it's a disorder, because I think you're always you're going to need something else as well. Basically, I think that on any account of dysfunction, if you're appealing to evolution or whatever, there's going to be loads and loads and loads of dysfunctions that we just don't care about at all. So I think dysfunction is not going to be sufficient to get an account of disorder. I'm not sure whether it's even going to play a necessary role. I'm not sure if it's going to be possible to get an account of dysfunction that's going to help in making sense of disorder. And I guess my view is that there's loads of people working on that kind of issue, kind of in the philosophy of biology, and good luck to them.
Thank you.
All right, so this is the end of this session. For those who like the event, we would like to invite you to the next session of the webinar. So Thursday, March 4th, Serife Tekin will give a talk entitled Rethinking Objectivity in Psychiatry, a new thing patients in epistemic practices. And as always, you can register on our website. And finally, of course, I would like to thank our speaker, Rachel Cooper, for this exciting talk. And also thank you to you for being here today. It's always good to see so many people enthusiastic and interested by philosophy of psychiatry. So bye, everybody, and see you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Oh, well, thank you very, very much for organising that.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you. Right. So Amrit, is there anything else that I need to do? Because there's a recording, isn't there?
Right, I should stop it